live.
Woo!
Woohoo! Okay, everybody. So, as you can see, we're here, we're live, we have cups of tea, and I would highly encourage you all to grab your favourite hot drink as well, because this is just going to be a very cozy, chatty, chill live show, the subject of which is, as you can tell from the title, Persuasion by Jane Austen. And that makes this the very last live show in the All About Austen Readalong, because Persuasion was Jane Austen's final published novel. It was published, I never know if I'm pronouncing this word right, posthumously, aka after she died.
I think you are.
I mean, it makes sense, but
I always think it's posthumously.
That sounds like more
like... Is that wrong?
That sounds like a snazzier way to say it.
Maybe we should have googled this
before. But I didn't plan the intro, it just kind of it flowed out. So anyway, Persuasion, published after Jane Austen had passed away, her final novel, her final completed novel anyway, and that brings us to the end of the All About Austen Readalong. So before we go any further, I just wanted to take a moment to applaud, congratulate and thank anyone who joined me on this Austen reading journey, because, you know, for the last 6 months I've been reading all of these books in publication order, and I know lots of you guys have joined as well, and it has been really, really fun. So if you joined in for some or all of them, then thank you so much for joining. Sarah joined
so well.
Thank you.
I commend you. I should have done very well.
Thank you very much. I mean, I definitely fell back behind on my schedule a few times.
Don't we all?
It's embarrassing when you've set a schedule and can't even keep to it.
Mate, I lost my book on the train.
We'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, so it's time to talk about Jane Austen, essentially. So, as always, I like to kick these off with just like a general Austen chat.
Okay.
So, you have now read how many of her books?
How many has she published? 6.
6.
I've read 5.
Okay. Do you care to give a ranking of them all?
Of them all, from bottom to top?
Bottom to top, yeah.
Okay. 5th is Persuasion. 4th is Northanger Abbey. 3rd, you know, I'm going to do a joint second. Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. They just kind of change.
Right.
And then Emma at the top.
Wow.
Because I was thinking more about Sense and Sensibility.
Yeah.
I really like it. But Pride and Prejudice, I just feel like is a classic.
Yeah.
In my eyes, you know.
There is definitely a lot to be said for, obviously, Pride and Prejudice being the most popular one. I think I often struggle with putting Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility next to each other, because I think Sense and Sensibility, parts of it I like a lot more, but then also I think Pride and Prejudice feels like a slightly more like refined writing style, whereas I think in Sense and Sensibility, being her first novel, it felt a little bit more like, I don't want to say juvenile, but like a little bit more like there was less balance in the writing style when she was like switching between the two sisters and things like that, and it just felt a bit clunkier and a little bit more like a book, whereas I think Pride and Prejudice is like very similar vibes, but it also has just like a slightly more elevated writing style, and you can feel like she's kind of like found her flow a little bit with that one.
Yeah, I think I really liked how Pride and Prejudice, you got more sisters, and they obviously had more of the storylines, like with Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
But then I kind of, Sense and Sensibility gave me what I wanted from Lizzie and Jane.
Yeah.
Because Jane was kind of just really neither here nor there. But I think Marianne and Eleanor, you got a lot more from it. And so I think it gave me that. But then I just loved all the little side bits in Pride and Prejudice. And the parents, I thought the humour was really good in that.
Yeah, I think Pride and Prejudice definitely has more humour. But yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm like, as we're talking now, trying to figure out what my ranking is. So obviously I've read all 6 of the books, and I know 100% which is my least favourite, and that is Mansfield Park, which is the one that you haven't read. I think would follow up with probably Persuasion as my next least favourite. Obviously, we'll dive into in-depth thoughts.
I was going to say, that's very promising for the live show, isn't it?
I won't say too much. I mean, I've not hated any of her books, so just to kind of clarify, it's not like least favourite means it was terrible. It's just, you know, not as good as some of the other ones. And then I get to the middle point, and that's where I get lost. Because I'm now thinking, I'm just going to throw it out there: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, Emma.
Interesting.
I always like struggle with the middle three because they all kind of have bits that I love and then bits that I'm not as keen on. So it's very difficult to rank them all. But I know for one thing for sure is that Emma is the best one.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So yeah, obviously would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the ones you've read. But to answer your question, I don't think she did save the best till last.
Absolutely not. If this is the best, then I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No.
And then we've got a favourite of Pride and Prejudice. Definitely understandable. It is obviously a classic, as all of her novels are. Okay, so I'm also interested to know if you have how many adaptations you've watched of Jane Austen books. Any?
I've only seen the 2 Pride and Prejudices.
Yeah.
Not seen any for Sense and Sensibility. I've seen parts of it. So I watched the trailer for one the other day on YouTube, and I realised parts of it I haven't watched.
Yeah.
But not actually to sit down and watch.
Okay.
Didn't know there was one of Persuasion.
Right.
Don't know if there's one of Northanger Abbey.
I think
or
there
Mansfield
is.
Park. I'm assuming there probably is, but Emma, I've only seen the newest one, the
Best
film.
one.
Yeah. So not a lot, really.
No, to say that there are so many out there, I'm definitely behind on watching them. I've not watched either of the Pride and Prejudices.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, my mum loves Colin Firth when it comes out of water.
I mean, I love Colin Firth as like a general rule of life.
No, this is...
But like, is it nicer than when he's in the water in Love Actually?
I think that's a spoof off of... Because apparently, if you're from the older generation, apparently when Colin Firth comes out the water and his shirt's all wet, his white shirt,
right,
it's supposed to be...
like Pride and Prejudice. That makes sense, but I've not seen it, so... the only ones I've personally watched are the new Emma, which is, I think, a cinematic masterpiece.
It's great.
An absolute delight to watch, and I love it. And it's just been put on Netflix, everyone, so drop everything after this live show, of course, and go and watch Emma because it's on there. And if you've got Netflix, you can watch it for free. And then I've also watched the Sense and Sensibility one with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet, Alan Rickman.
I need to watch that one because that's the one where she met her husband, Emma Thompson.
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't like it. I found it boring.
Yeah.
But
I think I have heard that from quite a few people.
It felt very long. I mean, it's over 2 hours, I think.
I think the original dramatisation of them, because they're all BBC, aren't they? BBC.
Yeah, well, that one's a film
ITV.
rather than a...
Oh, most of them are really, like even Wuthering Heights. They split that into the earlier ones are all always really long, multiple episodes.
Yeah, so it felt long, and it didn't feel particularly interesting. But yeah, so I've not watched many of them, but I definitely. Which one of Pride and Prejudice have you watched? Is it the one with Colin Firth or the one with Keira Knightley? Because I'm always in two minds about which one to watch. I mean, the one with Keira Knightley is on Netflix, so that one would probably be first choice because I wouldn't have to pay for it. Not to be cheap, but that's interesting. I do think Sense and Sensibility can maybe take a little while to warm up, but once you kind of like in the flow of it, I feel like it gets more fun. But that is definitely a fair point. Some of them can feel a little bit like tough to get through, so definitely fair enough point. I'd love to know as well, like from anyone watching or like you, what did you kind of like, what was your perception of Jane Austen before you started reading her books, and then like has that changed?
I first read Pride and Prejudice like 10 years ago now. Oh god, it makes me feel really old.
When you were what, like 14?
What do I think about Jane Austen before reading it? kind of thought she was my mother's
Cup of tea.
Yeah, because my mum had like this whole collection of like the books back when they were like 19p and stuff like that.
That's fun.
But so I thought she was like a classic romance writer,
Yeah.
and that was it really. I didn't really have a big idea about her. I feel like she seemed a lot scarier than like her writing style. I thought it would be like Charles Dickens.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I feel like when I first came across Jane Austen when I was a lot younger, I think didn't really have like a clear perception of like where she stood in history.
Yeah, I just thought all classics
With the
Charles
same.
Dickens.
Yeah, like I just kind of had this like picture of her being like an older writer, and I expected her works to be like dull, stuffy romances. And so then when I read them and now have like reread quite a few of them, I was like very taken by how like witty and funny she can be. And how like obviously there's usually a deeper message behind her novels and like, but like not in a preachy way. I don't know, I was just like, I found her books a lot lighter and less dense than I was expecting, which was a very nice thing to find.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's fun. Obviously would like to know, any of you guys have any different thoughts to share on your Jane Austen experience? Like, when did you first read her? Did you love her immediately, or did you kind of like have to come back to it later on? Or maybe you still don't like her and you're here to share some hate on Jane Austen. So any thoughts welcome. But I think we'll dive into Persuasion now, because we've chatted enough about general Jane Austen. So do you want to start by telling us your Persuasion disaster story? Because I feel like that's a nice way to enter into your thoughts on Persuasion.
I had the book, lost the book, left it on a train actually, which, you know, was my own fault. Nobody handed it in. Thanks. If you see a book on a train, hand it in, because most likely somebody wants it back.
If you're watching out there and you've just picked up a copy of
I would like the
Persuasion,
bookmark back, please. And yeah, so then I had to try to listen to it on Audible, downloaded the wrong version, then discovered I had it on my Kindle for free. So I started reading it on my Kindle, and I was bored. I didn't like it. I feel like I went through such a trauma with it, and such a journey that me not liking the book was just kind of the icing on the cake for the whole
reading
experience.
Wow. Yeah, you quite had quite the journey.
Ridiculous.
With Persuasion, not a good one. I had a much less dramatic reading experience. I simply started the book, read most of the book physically, and then in the last couple of days also listened to a few of the chapters on audiobook, just the one that is available on Audible, included in membership, because I just needed a little bit of help in getting through the last few pages. However, this was a reread for me because I read this one for the first time at university a few years ago. So I kind of was familiar with the storyline, but also it had been quite a few years, so a lot of the detail had kind of like faded away. If you were to rate the book, what would you rate it?
Don't rate books, but I would give it, you know what? I'd give it a 1.5.
I'm getting Tyra Banks vibes. I'd like to give you a 0, but this isn't possible. So
I'll give you
a 1.
Maybe that's a bit harsh. I'll give it a 2.
A 2.
Well, no, 1. I didn't hate. The trouble is, I didn't hate it. Like, I didn't think this is a disgusting book. I just was so bored.
That's a real shame.
I was just really bored, and I'm quite surprised that I was that bored, because I wasn't bored enough and grabby. I was just annoyed.
Yeah.
I don't think me and Jane Austen get along really, to be honest.
It's a real shame.
I mean, we do for the other 3 books.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, like, timeline-wise, you liked early Jane Austen.
Yeah.
More so than you liked her later works, which makes me think that maybe you should try Mansfield Park, because that was her 3rd book.
Yeah.
So
actually, now that you're talking about when she was young, my boyfriend was talking to me about Jane Austen juvenilia. Have you heard of that kind of stuff?
No.
She wrote a lot more things when she was younger that isn't actually published. It's all in archives, but it's all about it's kind of more free, if that's the right word to describe it.
Okay.
Like more kind of not sexually explicit, but more female empowered, like kind of just saucy kind of things. And apparently it's more different to
what she wrote.
Actual works.
Novels.
But none of it, because Sandition is published
Yeah.
as an unfinished one.
Yeah.
But her earlier stuff isn't like there's no collection of it whatsoever.
No.
Just in archives. And like you can find the odd image of it digitized.
Yeah.
But that's it.
That's interesting. I didn't know anything about that. So lol. I think this is fair enough personally. If I found a book on a train, I think it's your lucky day.
I just forgot.
Wow.
Well, you know what? It was in very good condition because 7 pages of it had been read.
So
That's it.
What we're saying is your misfortune is someone else's lucky break.
You know what annoys me though is when I was sat on the train,
Yeah.
there was a girl who was sat opposite the aisle and she was facing that way and I was facing that way. And as I was grabbing my stuff, she looked at me. So clearly looked at the fact the book was still on there. And if I saw somebody do that, even if they meant to leave it on purpose, I'd be like, oh, sorry, I think you left your book.
You might be overestimating how much she's actually paying attention though.
She looked me in my eyes.
So she was looking in your eyes, she wasn't looking at the table.
Well, she might have had a quick cheeky glance.
But she also might not have.
I was very close to the table.
I just think, you know, it might have been the case of like, you know, some people like leave their newspapers for the next person to read. Someone might have thought this girl loves Jane Austen and she wants to spread that Austen love.
You say, I would think that, but it had a bookmark in it on page 7.
Again.
Like, surely that would mean somebody's reading it.
But you also might have been like, I'm going to gift this bookmark to the next person and just have slotted it in there.
Absolutely not. It has my name on it.
Well, anyway.
I'm never going to get it back, so that's fine.
Yeah, it might have been that girl who took it.
Well, I hope she has a nice time reading it in English.
But back to rating. So you're giving it a 1.
A 1.
I was interested to find that when I had rated it at university, I'd given it 2 stars.
Oh.
But this time I gave it 3.
I think all of your books have moved. The ones that are rereads, I think they've all moved up.
Yeah, I've found more to appreciate in each Jane Austen novel each time I've reread them. So yeah, I've moved up from a 2-star to a 3-star. Very much in the like average lane of books. You know, not terrible, not brilliant. There were elements of it that I liked, but also stuff that was a bit less exciting for me.
I really am. I paid money for that book.
Well, you should have been more careful.
We know that. I know that. It's just a bookmark, you know, it's not even the book.
It's a real shame, but anyway. Okay, so let's dive into Persuasion in more depth. If you guys are also book raters, then feel free to let us know what you gave this one out of 5 stars. 1, 3, let's dive in. So, anyone who is just watching for the fun of it and maybe didn't read Persuasion, little overview is that this is Jane Austen's, I would say, most unique novel in the sense that it focuses on a much older protagonist, Anne Elliot, who is she 27?
Yeah, I think so.
So she's in her late 20s at the point that the book takes place. And the book and its romance is about her having once been persuaded by members of her family and acquaintances to turn down an engagement offer from a man called Frederick Wentworth. And then this guy, I've done a really bad job of explaining this.
This guy.
Rewind. So, Persuasion. In this book, we focus on Anne Elliot. Anne Elliot is 27 at the point that the book is taking place. However, at the age of 19, she was in a courtship with a guy called Frederick Wentworth, and he proposed to her. She wanted to say yes, but at this point in his life, he didn't really have many prospects, and she was persuaded by a particular family acquaintance, as well as her dad and her older sister, to turn this guy down, and she's been single ever since, essentially. Then, at the point that the book takes place at, so she's in her late 20s, we have Captain Wentworth now come back into Anne's life through mutual acquaintances, and he is now a very successful man of the Navy. And basically, it's all about how they come back into each other's lives, and all about kind of like that lost love, the rekindling of their relationship, and kind of like the consequences of her having been manipulated by other people to turn him down initially. So it's a very unique concept, I would say, compared to her other novels, because we have a much older protagonist, and instead of being about a young lady being kind of like put out into society to find a husband for the first time in her like teens or early 20s, instead it's kind of like about an older, more mature lady who is kind of like, it's like about lost love, essentially, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I do. I thought it would be a lot more interesting, but the only thing that annoyed me, well, no, multiple things annoyed me, but to say she was so much older, she still seemed to behave like she was 19, like she was as young as some of Jane Austen's other characters. Like she still had a very juvenile way of thinking that just didn't match up to everything. Like, so she has this awareness to end this engagement. Yeah, she's persuaded by family members, but she still has this awareness of their reasons and why their reasons are valid.
Yeah.
Yet when he comes back, she's just oblivious. And I felt like it didn't match. It felt like halfway through, in certain scenes, she just kind of regressed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the fact that she is older but still within the family dynamic, living with her dad and her sister, and then being kind of like surrounded by the same family acquaintances that would have been around at that earlier point, it's almost as if in turning him down when she didn't really want to, she was then kind of like kept back kind of like from progressing any further, because she, I guess, didn't want to move on with any other guy, and therefore just kind of was like left behind. And so
yeah, because the younger sister's married, like the youngest one, but the two older ones
are still at home.
Yeah, which is quite, for that time as well, that's quite an interesting thing, because normally the oldest marries first.
Yeah, you'd think so, especially given that in the family dynamic, Elizabeth, the oldest sister, is the dad's favourite. So you'd think he'd have been like more keen to kind of like get her set up properly. But I do think perhaps that's kind of something to be said for like the dad wanting to keep her around, and then Anne not really like pushing for herself to get married, and so them just being kept in this bubble as like a family of three, and then the dad and the sister being so like domineering kind of kept Anne from fully like emotionally developing, maybe.
Because maybe as soon as what's the youngest sister called? Mary. As soon as Mary goes, maybe Anne just kind of left to her own devices as a child, as like a youngish child would be, even though she's not the youngest one, but she is the youngest one in there.
And she's also treated and like spoken about like a child.
Yeah, that is true. I don't like Elizabeth.
Like the way that Elizabeth and the dad talk about her, and then Mary even says like, oh, I couldn't be without Anne or something like that when they're talking about going off to Bath. Mary is kind of just like saying she couldn't be without Anne, she needs her around her and everything. So it's almost like Anne is just kind of like a commodity to be either like used by other people or pushed around, and so she doesn't really have like a huge amount of like strength of character. And yeah, I think that's a good point that you raise. I think it's almost as if she's kind of like stunted at that earlier point from having been persuaded to turn down Captain Wentworth. So yeah, very interesting. An observation. So that's kind of like the background, and I think one thing to add on to that, and I think probably one of the cleverest literary devices of this novel is the introduction itself, and that is because I know you didn't like it.
I didn't mind the first like 2 pages, but when it surpassed into
Several more.
yeah, it just got a bit too much for me.
But if we look at, say, for example, Emma starts with the line about Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, had never wanted for anything, blah, 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 blah. Northanger Abbey starts with no one would have supposed Catherine Morland to have been a heroine, type of thing. So most of Jane Austen's novels start with like quite a succinct description of your protagonist. So then we kind of like understand who they are, how they fit into the story, and you kind of like have a bit of an understanding of like what kind of narrative you're getting into and who your main character is. Whereas this book starts with an introduction to Sir Walter, Anne's dad.
Yeah.
So it talks about him, his vanity, his obsession with the family tree, how excited he is to look and find his own name in it all of the time, how he only really cared about his wife and then his oldest daughter. They don't have any surviving sons, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's quite a while before you really get to understand who Anne is. And I think that's fairly significant because rather than pointing out a protagonist who is like a leading lady, we instead kind of learn about the protagonists through their association to other people. And I think that, without actually saying much about Anne at all, gives you a really good insight into her temperance, what's the word?
Yeah,
temperance, yeah. And like her standing within the family. And I feel like without even mentioning her at all, you start to understand like who she is and how she fits in the family dynamic, which I think is a really interesting way to kind of go about giving you that information.
I just think a bit shorter.
Could have been shorter.
A lot shorter.
Yeah, I understand that. I do. I know on Discord someone raised the question about whether or not I think Anne is like Fanny Price, who is the main character from Mansfield Park. I know you've not read it, so I'll take the lead on that one.
Go right.
And the reason that the person asked that question was because both of them kind of exist as like the lowest rung on the family ladder, essentially. However, I think it's slightly different because Anne is a member of the family. She is like very much within a family circle, although the dad doesn't really care for her, and although she's kind of trampled over by Elizabeth and she's kind of like a much meeker member of the family, she is part of that family and is like by birth like destined to be there, essentially. Whereas Fanny Price is like a much poorer family member who is kind of brought in by the goodness of this family's heart to kind of raise her in a better way, but she is by default there to be kind of like a bit of a companion. She's never there for like her own like prosperity, essentially. Whereas Anne could be, and I think it's like the difference is that Fanny, like that was never an option for her, and that kind of molded her personality. Whereas Anne could have like gone out and got married like Mary did at a younger age, but obviously just didn't. And I think there's definite difference in their characters in that sense and in the like circumstances of how they became who they were. However, there are definitely similarities on how they, I think, function within their family circles, which is interesting. Okay.
I would flick through mine, but you know.
You've not got one?
No.
Feel free to flick through mine if you want, just to feel.
Feel
it. Oh, there's an interesting comment. From Rick Jane Eyre, I believe Anne has a similar temperament to Jane. Trying to think back to Jane Eyre. Have you read Jane Eyre? Yeah. I feel like Jane has like a bit more ambition.
Wait, whose passion is more controlled, Jane or Anne's?
Anne's, I think. Like, I think Jane has a bit more substance to her, maybe. And also, again, talking about Fanny Price, Jane was like sort of kept down by like societal standards. Like she wasn't of a wealthy family. She was just a relative of a wealthier family. And so she never really had the same kind of like options and opportunities. Whereas I feel like Anne did, but just kind of like didn't use them essentially.
I'd definitely say Jane's got more about her.
Yeah.
Like I think Jane has a lot more awareness than Anne.
Yeah.
I think Jane knows things, knows where she stands in a hierarchy. She understands different things.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Anne just kind of...
It's almost as if Anne like acts as though she's from a lower...
Yeah, I think Anne
social
seems to be
standing.
quite ignorant of... But whether that's purposeful ignorance or accidental ignorance, I think...
Yeah, or like whether that has just been like built in from the treatment of like her sister, maybe, like to feel as though she's like lesser and to not really put herself out there because she doesn't have that opportunity at home. But yeah, I definitely think it's interesting because Anne has far more opportunity available to her without question, but doesn't really go out there and take it. Whereas
Jane really tries to like work hard.
She kind of like goes for it, despite all of the odds being against her. So I think it's interesting. Yeah, there could be some similarities, but I don't think they're like hugely similar characters personally. Yeah, so I think generally speaking, you go into a Jane Austen novel expecting some kind of romance to be the key focus of the book, and obviously she always likes to comment on society, and she also likes to sort of create a bit of moral message and that kind of thing within her book. So you always do get other bits of information, and you see the characters functioning both as part of a romance and part of other relationships in the novel. So the romance is never the only thing going on, but you usually expect it to be more prevalent.
Yeah, like you can kind of, if there wasn't an engagement, I think in Persuasion in the beginning, or like how we were told years ago that Anne had called it off.
Yeah.
I don't think we would have really understood the dynamic between those two. I don't think it was as obvious as anything. And I think at certain points, it was hard to believe that they were once engaged. I think there were definitely points when I thought, wait, have I... Because also, I would argue there's so many characters in this book. Like, I thought at one point, this is just too convoluted. And I remember reading it, I can't remember what scene it was, but between Anne and Captain Wentworth and thinking, have I misread the name? Like, am I reading about Anne and a different male character?
Yeah.
Because I don't see how these two were once engaged, but then other scenes is different, and you can see a better relationship. I just think it seemed a bit mismatched, but then that could be because they're obviously not going to see each other and be like, I love you, you know, let's get back again, you know. So that could have been an artistic choice by Austen as well. But I thought at some point so many characters were introduced, I was losing the plot.
Yeah, I think for me, the downfall of this book was the fact that it had so many things going on that, if we're really honest, didn't have a lot of consequence in the overall plot, therefore felt just like a little bit pointless and distracting. And so that kind of like took away from the book for me, because like you say, I personally think Captain Wentworth and Anne's relationship would have been a lot more interesting to dive into and kind of like to get both of their perspectives in more depth on what happened the first time around and like how things changed the second time and all that kind of stuff. But I actually feel like you don't really get a huge amount of that, and instead it just feels like a bit rushed and a bit forced and less authentic because you've spent so much time with like other storylines going on. Yeah,
it's definitely like Austen was like, right, okay, this book is going to end with them two together. Doesn't matter how I get there, but they're going to end together.
Yeah.
Like, it felt like she'd missed out chapters.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to know, like, what the original manuscript was like versus, like, how it was edited and things like that, especially given that obviously this was published after her death. Yeah. So we don't really know, like, what her vision for it was, essentially.
How, when she died, because obviously this one and Northanger Abbey were both published
1816, I think
it was. After she died. How finished were her drafts?
yeah, like, was it just the fact that there was a full manuscript, therefore people said, right, that's finished, boom?
Yeah.
Or like, we don't know, like, how much more work she would have wanted to do to them,
Exactly.
or what like additions and revisions she would have wanted to make. But for me personally, I just think, yeah, that the Captain Wentworth and Anne relationship, like, the only reason we have any investment in it is just because we are told that there is history. But does
Yeah.
that feel like natural chemistry? I don't think it does.
No.
So yeah, I definitely think it's less about the romance, which to me is a shame, because I think it has probably like one of the strongest like potentials as like a romance plot, because like that forgotten love being rekindled, like that's such an interesting concept.
Yeah.
And
Everyone loves a reunion.
she could have done so much more with it, I think, but it just kind of was a bit flat for me.
I think it'd be interesting to watch the adaptation
Yeah.
and see how the love is portrayed in that.
And I wonder if they would like show any flashbacks, maybe.
Yeah, and like bump it up a little bit.
Because I think, again, it would have just been nice to like see a bit more insight into the relationship as it first stood. Like, how did they like properly meet and get to know each other? Like, how romantic and like frivolous was it, or was it quite like, I don't know?
Yeah,
like,
because she was 19, and in those days, like that's quite an acceptable age.
but it seems as though like maybe it was kind of like done a bit under the radar, or like, you know, it wasn't in like a formal courtship setting, because otherwise, like, would the dad have turned it down? Or like, would she have been persuaded not to, if it would have gone through proper channels originally? So it seems as though it was kind of like a bit more of a hidden romance, and then she just couldn't cope with the fact that people didn't view it properly.
Yeah, because Lady Russell definitely had a...
Lady Russell was the instrumental opinion, wasn't she? But I just think it would have been a much stronger plot if we would have had a more detailed insight into the original romance and how that all went down, and then like maybe some like filler, like to kind of show like how they got from 19, ended of the engagement, to nearly 10 years later, and like to see like the effect of that on their personal development and stuff. Because again, I just think, you know, we see them as two very different people. Like, we understand that they're like quite different and changed from the point of their original engagement, so it would have been interesting to kind of see more of that evolution for me.
That's the thing, it's almost 10 years.
Yeah,
because I'm sure Elizabeth's the one who's 29.
Yeah, I'm sure Anne is 27.
Yeah.
So
almost 10 years, and Wentworth's gone and been a captain in the Navy?
The Navy.
Yeah. So that's obviously a huge change in someone's character from when they're also maybe 19, I don't know.
He's probably a bit older.
Yeah, from when that peak time.
Yeah.
And then Anne obviously is still in the same setting, but to then just suddenly expect that the engagement's been called off, they're reunited almost 10 years later, and yet still nothing's really changed.
Yeah, the only real like insight that we get into Anne's change is essentially like that she is still a really nice person, but that she's no longer beautiful.
Yeah. Jane Austen is really savage to certain people in her books. Like, to say she writes them as main characters.
Like, see what everyone was saying about her. Like,
this happens in Northanger Abbey when she calls is it Catherine?
Catherine,
when she's like, she's basically so plain she's almost ugly. Yeah,
and then she's like, she went from being plain to almost pretty. Yeah. And to be almost pretty when you were once plain is far better than to have been always beautiful. Like, she's really savage and very appearance focused.
Do you think, because they're in her last two books, do you think the editors maybe convinced her to take out those insults out of the earlier books? She insulted.
I don't really know how it happened in terms of like.
This is what I'm interested to know, because obviously now there's a such strict editing process. How did it happen in those days?
Yeah, I'd be interested to
How
know.
did a woman approach a publishing house?
What were her books published under? What name?
I thought she was just Jane Austen.
Was
Should we
she?
Google it?
Because obviously all the Brontes were.
They were bells, weren't
Yeah. But yeah, essentially, I think what is missing from this book isn't potential, because I think the premise is interesting, but I think execution just tried to do too much in too few pages, give us too many characters, too many plot lines, and didn't actually give like the depth of information about the two characters that we really wanted to know about. And that, I think, is the downfall of this book.
She didn't write under, so they've only included Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Persuasion, Sense and oh no,
All of them.
Ignore that. She didn't have a male pen name,
Yeah.
but she did publish all of her novels anonymously with the front covers of her books by simply stating "by a lady." So never actually said Jane Austen,
but it did go
But it was
out
clear
as
they
a woman's books. Interesting.
You're just a lady.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
When did the Brontes write?
They were 1800s as well, right?
Okay. Yeah, a bit later. So
Jane Austen was in a more privileged position as well, though.
That is true, and she was in Bath, wasn't she? Not necessarily.
Like, she was much
Bradford.
richer,
Really
whereas,
Bradford,
like, yeah, rural Yorkshire parsonage girls probably were like, right, these have got to go to a proper publisher. Or we need a man's name, but anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a bit of a detour, but interesting. So she didn't publish under any name, just under
a lady.
By a lady, which is interesting.
You know what? Fair dues to her.
Go on, Jane. So let's talk about the information that we do get about Captain Wentworth and Anne as we lead up to the reunion of their romance, essentially. So a lot of miscommunications happen, as is the case in a lot of Jane Austen novels. And as we start to get towards the point of their romance kicking back off again, I think it's interesting that they don't really talk about what happened in that much detail.
Yeah, and you'd think, right, correct me if I'm wrong, but you'd think if you're gonna meet somebody, there's clearly all this history.
Yeah.
They were engaged, like it was a serious relationship. You'd think surely Wentworth would have more feelings.
Yeah.
He needed to discuss.
Yeah.
About the whole situation. Because surely if you're gonna, wouldn't you need the reassurance that she's been persuaded once?
She's not going to do it again.
Yeah.
I feel like they touch on that briefly.
But not
in that much depth. Like, I don't think she really fully explains to him how she was persuaded the first time.
Yeah, and I don't think she acknowledges how
hurtful.
Yeah.
Like how difficult it would be to trust her again. And what we learn from Captain Wentworth is that he then struggled to trust her intentions with other men because he couldn't imagine that she liked him because, of course, she turned him down the first time. And I just think it's interesting that we don't really get to learn too much about like how she convinces him. Like suddenly they go from being very apprehensive, not really saying anything, and then all of a sudden there's just this confession of love.
Yeah.
Which again, I just feels a bit sudden. I don't think we've got enough of a like reunion time period going on.
Considering if their relationship was more prominent in the book, like in the middle, then I feel like I could forgive that because we would have had more of a build-up.
Yeah.
More of an explanation, more interaction.
Yeah.
But it's like that was just skipped out. It's like where Lady Russell or Louisa or another character just on the sidelines and suddenly these two people see each other again and then they're back together. It's kind of like we're viewing it from that angle to a certain degree, I think. Yeah,
I think it's almost as if we don't get that like proper like insider viewpoint.
Yeah, it's like everything else we got from Emma, we got from Sense Sensibility, we got from Northanger Abbey. Like you don't it's like it's just skipped.
Yeah, it feels as though you're just kind of like skimming the surface, but like really, like let's think about now. People can be in relationships with as many people as they want to be. You could have several serious relationships if you wanted to. And like you don't have to be engaged, you don't have to get married, you could just do whatever you want. And obviously like relationships can be a bit, they're obviously a lot freer than they were then. And if now, even in those circumstances, you broke off an engagement with someone and then came back into their life several years later, you'd imagine there would be like some discussion, some like, just like putting out the history on the table and seeing like where you sit now, now that times have changed. So the fact that back then romances and stuff were so much more like regimented and so much more serious, there wasn't like casual dating and things like that. The fact that they were engaged means probably even more
definitely
than it does now, like in terms of like how much that has an impact on like how serious your relationship is considered. So it just seems odd that they kind of like just skip the fact that it was like such a serious thing.
It's almost as if, because I know we touched on this in the Northanger Abbey live show, because obviously Jane Austen was engaged, or maybe it wasn't. We're a bit hazy on the details, but there was maybe an engagement there, and that's why she stops with the engagement, because she's not sure about the after effects. So maybe this is where this book falls short, because she's not, by my knowledge anyway, I could be wrong on this, she's not had the experience that she clearly has written about before.
Yeah, I guess like, probably this is like her most comparable character to her own self, because she did call off an engagement.
Yeah, but she never had the reunion maybe that she wanted.
No,
this
exactly.
is pure speculation.
So yeah, or maybe this is like what she wishes would have happened if it would have been a guy that she actually would like, whereas obviously she didn't really like him enough. I don't know. It just feels as though there is some depth lacking there, especially I think on the perspective of Captain Wentworth. And like, it's understandable that Anne, who did love him the entire time essentially, could easily be like swayed back into it, and now that she's older and maybe like more like strong in her own beliefs and is less persuadable, that she would like want to go back into it. However, Captain Wentworth has been abandoned one time, then has to convince himself that she actually likes him at all. I just feel like it would have been nicer to get a bit more understanding of how he kind of like defrosted his heart again.
Yeah, because as well, dialogue isn't something Jane Austen struggles with. It's not like she doesn't write about couples conveying emotions to one another.
Yeah.
Like I would argue she's very, very good at that. So why? And it's not like she's not written about difficult conversations either.
Yeah.
Or even, like, if we take Northanger Abbey, when, what's his face? Is it Henry? Yeah, when Henry's telling Catherine off when she's being crazy, essentially, about
the Abbey.
The Abbey. And he's like, what are you talking about? She doesn't shy away from a man saying his feelings or saying what you're on about. Yeah,
or in Emma, when Emma is really rude to Miss Bates and Mr. Knightley basically is like, I'm so disappointed in you.
Yeah.
I can't believe that you are so unaware of your own privilege. Check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Exactly.
So she can write these like, she can write big sort of like expressions of romance, but she can also, like you say, write those more difficult and like more uncomfortable conversations as well between two romantic partners. So that is kind of really, I think, because it's such a dramatic situation, abandoned of an engagement and then getting back together nearly 10 years later and like starting a romance again stronger than it ever was before. So I just think the fact that we don't really get, it touches on it briefly, his lack of trust and that kind of stuff, but I think it's such a big thing, probably instrumental in the way that his life panned out and how he like didn't really get into any other relationships.
Because also 10 years in that time, I'm not saying the life expectancy was 30, but at least 50.
Yeah.
Like, so 10 years.
It's a big amount of time.
It is quite a significant amount of time, and in terms of childbirth and
yeah, and the fact that he had just like gone away to like work for pretty much that entire time, it would have just been very interesting, I think, to understand like how long it took him to kind of like get back on his feet. Was he like fueled by rage or just like sadness? And then how did he feel initially upon like seeing Anne? When did he start to like consider that he might pursue her again? You know, there's a lot of questions, I think, that are just like left, I think, a bit too much to the imagination.
I really wonder, maybe if this is, obviously we don't know how many drafts she wrote, we don't know her writing process, we don't know how editing novels worked back in those days, but I wonder if this is maybe her, because obviously it's quite a experimental novel for her, I think, in the way it's constructed.
Yeah.
I think maybe because it was so experimental, she wrote this as a basis with the intention of then going back and working in maybe more of it. And also, I think it's quite strange for Jane Austen to have so many characters and for them all to be so convoluted. Like, that's not normally something she struggles with either.
Yeah.
So maybe it is that it's just not finished.
Yeah, it just wasn't at like the level that she would have had it to if it was, you know, published while she was alive. Yeah, I definitely think, you know, that kind of doesn't change my rating of it because you can only rate what you've got, but it is interesting to consider that extra context, I think, and just kind of think about, well, maybe this isn't how she would have put it out to the world.
Yeah, because I just think that the difference is so far.
Although it does feel like, you know, obviously Northanger Abbey, for example, feels more complete.
Yeah,
than
definitely.
This one.
Definitely.
I do think one of my critiques of Jane Austen's novels in general is that she often rushes the conclusions. So you get a lot of build up, a lot of like back and forth, usually between the two people that the romance is all about.
Yeah.
And then there are often miscommunications, things that are left unsaid, people like not really understanding what the other person's feeling, not wanting to put themselves out there, all of those kinds of great things. And then eventually either someone cracks and it confesses their feelings, or an external person, as we get in this novel, kind of like explains the scenario to the other person.
Oh, I hate that.
Where it just kind of feels like, rather than taking you through the story, someone's just like, right, I've got 2 pages, let's give you everything that you need to know to fill in the gaps and get us to where we want to be. And because the rest of her novels feel like that you get a lot of detail, I think it often feels as though the ending is kind of rushed into just a couple of chapters where she needs to give both of the main characters all of the information about how the other one feels, and then they end up like getting together and getting married like immediately.
Yeah.
And that was the case in this book as well, but it's not a critique of just this novel, because I do feel like that is the case in a lot of her books, is that you get much more detail about like the lead up, and then the confession of romance and the actual part where the two people are genuinely in a couple is like so close to the very end, and that's kind of like it. So that was a critique I had, not only of this one, of all of Jane Austen's novels, but I think because in this one it also felt like we didn't actually get that much of them together courting.
Yeah,
the ending being rushed felt even more like a letdown, because it felt like, all right, we've not had much lead up. I don't feel super invested in them as a couple. Only reason I believe that they could be a couple is because I know that they were engaged.
Yeah.
And then you've got this rush of confession at the end, and then they're like married. And so it just felt very lacking, especially, given the lack of like time we have of them together throughout the novel as well.
Yeah.
So
I definitely agree.
I think that's probably a good wrap up of our feelings on it. It was, I think, for me, not a bad book at all. I just think it was, I think I like Anne Elliot as a protagonist more than I like Fanny Price, which is why I'm putting this one in second least favourite position rather than least favourite. I think this is a more interesting plot, in terms of like the premise being quite unique compared to her other books. However, when I think about like Pride and Prejudice and Emma and things like that, I think they're just so much more fun and engaging, and you really like root for the protagonist of those ones. Whereas I think Anne wasn't dislikable for me; she was just kind of like bland.
It's kind of like she was coming to the end.
Yeah. So it's a couple of questions. I don't think you'll have one off the top of your head, but is there a quote from Persuasion that you love?
No. I do like the one on the back of your
Yeah,
book.
that's the only one I was going to say as well. So I have this edition of Persuasion, which is the vintage classics, and they all have the title of the book on the front, and then on the back there is a little quote from the book as well, and they always pick a good one, but this one I think is particularly nice because it's so dramatic, and it says, "You pierce my soul, I'm half agony, half hope, I've loved none but you." And honestly, if the rest of the book had that kind of punch to it,
Yeah, because
that's a real good quote.
So
like,
much.
That's got so much passion and intensity. And if any of you guys have also read Anna Karenina, this is giving me Levin vibes from a certain point of that novel. And I think it's just got a lot of power to it. Whereas the rest of the book not got quite so much power and punch to it. So yeah, that's a good quote though. Do you think Lady Russell was right?
What, in terms of
persuading Anne, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
You do?
No, I was just saying, I don't really know because I'm not that invested in the relationship. So if we look at it from where they write for each other, I don't really think so. So if we take it, but I think that's because we don't really get that much of them together. So if we take it from that angle, then I'd say she was, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
But still, it's not a nice thing to do.
I have a different viewpoint. And one of the things I talked about in my reading vlog of this book is the fact that I think all of Jane Austen's novels have kind of like a bit of a moral message to them. And I think in this novel, the message is kind of like a warning against judgment. And I think that the entire reason that Anne was persuaded to turn down Captain Wentworth originally was because that he wasn't seen to be a suitable partner based on his present circumstances. Now, as we can see, those present circumstances were not reflective of his entire future, and he actually ended up going on to make himself a very successful man. Meanwhile, Sir Walter, who is Anne's dad and is a baron, so therefore would have been considered like a esteemed gentleman, ends up kind of like being stupid with his money and ended up sort of running himself into a much less prestigious circumstance, despite still having a title that would signify importance. And I think Lady Russell, although she is, like a good friend to Anne, is ultimately a bit of a snob and allowed her own perception of society's judgments to unfairly influence a young lady who didn't necessarily have like as much understanding of the wider world. And therefore made this snap judgment on Captain Wentworth's present circumstance with no foresight or like appreciation for the fact that you can change and that people can develop and grow and like better their circumstances. So I think personally for me, Lady Russell wasn't right because clearly in them ending up together at the end, like they were in Jane Austen's eyes meant to be together. Their love was like strong and was able to weather that kind of like circumstance. And I personally am a big advocate for like growing with your partner kind of thing. Like I feel like it's nice when you see people who are like, they're not marrying someone for like their money or anything, you know what I mean? Like you're getting with someone because it's like them that you're interested in. And it would have been like, I think, a much cuter story if they'd stayed together. She might have like Anne it would have been nice to see Anne say like, I don't care if we're poor, I love you situation, and then have him still have succeeded and then have like grown and succeeded together as a couple versus oh, you weren't good enough for me then, but you've proven that you can be better, therefore I will have you now.
Yeah,
like
seems a bit
it's
shady.
like it's very shallow, and I feel like although in one sense the message of the book is don't judge people, and they ended up together, so I don't think Lady Russell was right. In another sense, it does make Anne seem to be a very shallow protagonist who is like only willing to be with someone who was successful.
Yeah, she doesn't seem to...
Like, it just would have been so much nicer if, you know, she would have been willing to risk it all for a guy.
Yeah, because we don't properly know how easily Anne was
Persuaded.
Like, was it one afternoon that she decided to actually make the decision? Was it a lot more brewing?
Yeah, that's the thing. Persuasion being the title, it would have been so much more interesting, I think, to like have the book. The book is split into 2 volumes, to have had a then and a now volume, and to be able to see their original courtship, how it all happened, how she was persuaded, how easily, like you say, she gave up, and like what happened then, and then maybe pick up again 10 years later in the now.
That would have been good.
That would have been so much better.
Ending
and I think
volume 1 with Anne like going to see him and saying like, we need to talk or something like that.
And then we would have been so much more invested in them as a couple, I think.
Exactly. And
So,
their reunion would have been...
Yeah, whereas in not having the history in a lot of depth, and then the way that Lady Russell persuaded Anne, and then her deciding to go for him again when he comes back as a successful person, just makes her look like shallow and not very nice. So not a vibe. We don't stand. We don't stand Anne. But on that note, I think on that note, I think that brings Persuasion to an end, and with it, the All About Austen Readalong. So, as I said at the beginning, big thank you to anyone who joined us for this read along, whether just for Persuasion or for any of the other books. And I would also like to just quickly mention that Sarah and I have an exciting announcement coming out next weekend, so keep your eyes peeled for that. All I'll say is there'll be more live shows to follow.
Subscribe.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, thanks so much for watching, guys. See you next time. Bye.